all of these things are actually being done in a way to set an agenda, the agenda of narrative, like what is allowed to discuss in this country and what should be discouraged.
Hello and welcome to the second GDF Think Tank session brought to you by Global Digital Futures. This is our YouTube series where we carry on the conversations that we're having on our podcast with people in the field who are making an impact. So this session is, the jumping off point is our podcast interview with Bhavjit Singh, founder of Tractor to Twitter. And we were talking about online activism and digital freedom. So yeah, we're expanding that conversation. Joining us today is Yashaswini Basu from the Internet Freedom Foundation. Shristi Jaswal, an independent journalist at The Caravan and News Laundry, as well as other media, and Vakasha Sachdev, associate editor legal at The Quint. And we also have our GDF Think Tank members, Umran Chowdhury, a lawyer studying LLM at SOAS, and Eliza Bacon, also studying at SOAS and a member of the GDF team. So I'm gonna kick off where, this is all sort of the foundation of this discussion is around the BJP IT rules. I wanted to maybe start with you, Vakasha. Maybe you could tell us, for our audience who doesn't know, what are the BJP IT rules? Why are they rules rather than laws? And how do they fit into the legal framework?
The new IT rules which have been introduced in 2021, and I'll give you the exact name of them, is the Information Technology, and now in brackets, Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code Rules 2021. And both these aspects are very, very crucial. Now, obviously, this is brought in by the current Indian government, which is the BJP itself. The rules themselves obviously are just, under the national name. The issue is basically over the way that the current government in India has brought in these rules and what the content of these is going to be. Now, the first part, as you mentioned, why are these rules and why aren't they sort of as a law? And that's actually that's one of the biggest controversies over all of this, because India has what is the legislation dealing with information technology stuff is the Information Technology Act. So, it's what prescribes your basic intermediary protections. It's what provides for penalties for hacking. It's what provides for even the very limited sort of protections for sensitive personal data which we have in India, for instance, are placed within this legislation. Now, the scheme of the act is that it sort of has all of these things, and it also has various points where it says that the sort of formalities and the niceties of these issues will be prescribed in rules. Now, as a result, we have a whole set of different kind of rules. Some of these deal with interception of communications. Some of these deal with blocking of things. I mean, as we know, with the internet these days, there's a lot of websites which tend to get, which tend to create worries for governments. And as we've seen recently with a lot of Twitter accounts in particular, as you'll have seen it during your podcast, the Indian government likes to block those. Now, there is a framework within that which comes out of the rules. The basic provision is Section 69A of the Information Technology Act, which gives the power to do that. But then there's a set of rules which are used for the sort of nitty-gritties of how it will work. Now, that's sort of why these new rules are really controversial, because they actually don't tie to anything within the Information Technology Act specifically. They kind of are an entirely new set of regulation of specific kinds of digital entities without necessarily deriving any basis from the Information Technology Act. And the reason the government's done this and sort of gone through these rules, it's a lot easier for them to just kind of push through these things and have very little oversight than if they go to Parliament with making a law. Now, given the current BJP has a huge majority in parliament, they'll probably even be able to get anything they want passed. But they're still not even bothering to do that here because, in a sense, there are a lot of advantages to going down the rules path because, secondary legislation in India, it's been proliferating over the years, and it's something which there's very little oversight added into those, whether you have whether legislative or even judicial oversight. And that's why, again, some of the crucial issues with this new set of rules come in with that. So to just wrap up, because I don't want to kind of hog the conversation at the start, but essentially the two biggest issues with these new rules are that they are creating rules for digital news media outlets like ours, like the Quint, which I work for, and even for things like Netflix and Amazon, just out of the blue without having any sort of legislative basis for it. They're just kind of trying to create rules to kind of clamp down on this. And what they're essentially trying to do is they've created a whole set of saying that, you have to have a grievance redressal mechanism. And that's essentially a by proxy way of being able to use trolls and, just any sort of random complaints to kind of go after digital media and force people to self-censor. To force platforms like Netflix and Amazon, which have been trying to create a lot of Indian-focused content of it, to make that steer clear of political issues or steer clear of socially sensitive issues, whether it's communalism, caste issues, and so on. So, I think obviously the other big thing which they're going after, they're trying to find a way to go after is intermediary platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, which don't themselves publish content, but where you have users publishing content through those. And they're really trying to find ways, they're trying to focus, make it easier for them to go after them, because these are platforms where you are seeing the exercise of free speech in India, as you will have seen with the farmers' protest, as we're now even seeing now people talking about, say, the Pegasus issue, the Pegasus hack. Is so much of it is happening on social media, and they want to find ways to kind of clamp down on that, because there are no sort of ways to really sort of enforce some very draconian orders, which they might look to do. Whereas now, by kind of with some of the things which they're trying to do with these rules, like having local grievance redressal officers and having it's saying that they're going to remove the sort of safe harbor which intermediaries have under the IT Act through these rules. They're trying to make ways to do that.
Yeah, so I think it's so broad and touched on so much, but it was really interesting that a couple of things that you pinpointed, I think, is really like a narrative control. I think, the Twitter and other social media conversations are more at the forefront, but it's really interesting what you pointed out as well about like even platforms like Amazon and Netflix and what sort of content and narratives can be created around that. Yeah. So I want to get a bit deeper into that. Shristi, you're in the media as well. You've also been doing specific things I want to get into with the caravan around the Twitter ban there. So yeah, what does this environment mean for free media? What does it mean for even activism online, and how are narratives being controlled?
I think I would agree to this thing that narratives are being controlled, because even if we say like these IT rules, or the way under these IT rules, various publications were withheld, including Tractor Twitter as well as Caravan India's Twitter page, or maybe the trolling that happens online. All of these things are actually being done in a way to set an agenda, the agenda of narrative, like what is allowed to discuss in this country and what should be discouraged. I would specifically like to tell this with the example of trolling that happens online. And I've seen this in a lot of cases, like if you say something which is against the popular narrative, which is against what is being propagated, so either you will be trolled, you will be slapped with the cases, and there is this definition being ingrained in the people's mind, like this is anti-national, or this is anti-Hindu, or this is this or that. So these, if you see in a larger picture, this is nothing but just creation of an agenda. Like this can be discussed in our country, and this is off the limits. And off the limits is defined through all these things. So the new IT rules, for example, they give the legal basis for setting up these agendas. So, you can't discuss this particular thing. You cannot do this thing. So, and, for this government, in all likelihood, setting the narrative, how is this government perceived, is, I think, one of the foremost and the most important priority so far. Even if we see with the recent Pegasus Snoopgate scandal, or with multiple places, what the government is most focused on is how people perceive this government, the narrative, how people actually think of the current BJP government. I think that is the foremost and the topmost agenda of this government currently, to maintain that. Given the pandemic or the farmers' protest and a couple of other places also, the government is trying to control the information through a seal so that it can be perceived as something which is which is a good government for, of course, the electorate purposes.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And I think it's, I mean, there's obviously like the political aspect as well, but there is also just the consideration of any minority groups, and how they can express themselves freely online, and how narratives become like the dominant ones, etc. So I want to actually pose the next question to Yashaswini, just sort of, yeah, like even pulling it back from the specific government or political aspect. What does this mean for the average user? What does it mean for digital freedom and just user experience online? Yashaswini.
Thanks, Chipo. And I think I've gotten some very interesting points to get into the conversation from my previous speakers. So thank you, Akasha and Srishti, for that. And I agree that it has grave implications for everyday users of online media like you and me. And I think social media plays such an irreplaceable role in our lives right now. It's become the town halls of our modern world. So rules of these sort are bound to sort of impact our lives. And these specific rules, which come in addition to several other information technology rules that exist already, be it the 2009 blocking rules, 2009 decryption rules, and we also have a separate intermediary rules that was that's dated in 2011, and of course the statute. Over and above that, these rules sort of impact or sort of create overcompliance for everyday, for intermediaries, and by extension us as users of these social media platforms. So one important way is that one of the rule, this is specifically rule 4.2, requires on receipt of these specific government orders, they will require the social media intermediaries to break your end-to-end encryption, identify the originator of the message. So that goes a long way in eradicating your right to privacy as a user of online media. And at the same time, it will sort of create a chilling effect on your freedom of speech. Now, very interesting that this is happening in India, because in India, the Supreme Court of India, not only does our constitution recognize these rights as fundamental to us, but also our Supreme Court has actually given it, constitutional status, upholds these values. So when you pitch such a rule, an executive order that too, against the constitutional background of the rights that we have, we do notice a contradiction, and we see that our freedom of expression as well as the right to privacy of users are increasingly getting threatened. So on the very constitutional terms. And what we see right now is, of course, greater surveillance, possibility of surveillance, greater content monitoring, and as you had mentioned earlier, there is a huge possibility of narrative control as well. But what this rule aimed to achieve, which is basically greater accountability and transparency building, that we've seen there is a lacuna in it. Of course, we welcome the fact that there is scope for counter notices and the scope for an opportunity to hear when a notice of takedown is given. But just wanted to take the example of a recent, quite a gut-wrenching incident actually. There was an unidentified account which was posted on GitHub, which was unanimously auctioning off women belonging to Muslim women who were just their faces were walked off from their social media accounts and along with their handles, and they were literally auctioned off. And this app ran for 20 days with impunity before it was flagged. So we really see that, more than actually holding accountable, perpetrators or bringing in the right type of content moderation and data protection, these rules will actually enable or facilitate narrative control. And, I've got my journalist friends here, they've seen that the impact that it has on independent journalism, on independent or voices of dissent. We've got, dissentients are now just being locked up behind bars for expressing themselves on social media. So these are, huge considerations to be kept in mind, and just to reevaluate and assess whether how effective this law is in actually fulfilling the purpose for which it was instituted. So I think that's the question.
Yeah, you've brought up quite a few points that remind me of the, or just bring to mind the UN Special Rapporteur's like recent reports. She spoke of like trying, or she writes about a new type of smart regulation and what that would entail, as well as sort of criticizing the use of criminal law, even against like disinformation or fake news, and unless it's at the, there's a high risk of, violence or, other issues. And I know, Umran, that's something that, when we were speaking about this before, you were quite interested in the special rapporteur report as well. Do you have any like sort of comments or thoughts around that?
Thanks, Chipo. Well, just to pick up from the previous speakers, there are concerns about due process, about India's own due process and how the IT rules were enacted. I believe the Quint and several other media organizations, they have filed lawsuits in high courts across India, in Delhi, in Bombay, in Madras, in Kerala and Karnataka. And I believe the Kerala High Court has already given an interim relief. The Indian government wants to transfer all these cases into a single case in the Supreme Court, but I think that's being denied. So I just saw a New York Times piece, and there was this was from 2018, and there was talk of the so-called guillotine procedure in the Indian Parliament, which is basically the BJP government pushing through legislation without any sort of scrutiny from the MPs, which is against India's own traditions. And there are fears that the government may try to guillotine its way through the courts. So that's an area of concern. The special rapporteurs on freedom of expression, the special rapporteur on privacy, and the special rapporteur on freedom of association, they sent a letter to the Indian government on the 11th of June, and they also raised this issue of the IT rules having, the need for the IT rules to be scrutinized by Parliament and by civil society. And that hasn't happened. The IT rules were enacted under the IT Act of 2000. And I believe a lot of people in India believe that the IT rules are actually in violation of the IT Act. They go beyond the scope of the IT Act. And the special rapporteurs, I believe they raised three areas of concern. One is about social media, the fact that there is a distinction made between big tech and smaller media companies. And this might actually create an issue for competition in the free market. It's also about how the regulation is extremely sweeping. For example, impersonating a person, impersonating someone can be considered illegal. And there are also concerns about the right to privacy. And we were talking about the Pegasus controversy. And I'm a member of Project Aristotle, which looks at digital governance in many parts of the world. And I was looking at the case of Rwanda. And in Rwanda, the Pegasus software is being used to enable to hack into WhatsApp accounts and put in spyware and monitor people's activities. So the basic concern with this sort of technology is that without a court warrant, you can't actually trace people. And this concern has also been raised by the special rapporteurs. They have cited the Shreya Singhal case by the Supreme Court of India, in which it's stated that you need a reasonable order from a judicial or a government authority to allow the police to trace someone using using technology. So basically, if you want to disrupt end-to-end encryption, you need to have a court warrant, you need to have judicial review, and we're not seeing that. And finally, there are concerns about media freedom, how digital media content can be removed, without any oversight, without any scrutiny, and it's more of a remove the content first and ask the questions later approach. So yeah, these are areas of concern raised by the special rapporteurs.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think one of the, in the special rapporteur report, it was quite interesting that she did sort of go into the roles of the different, like the platforms themselves, the government's role in it, etc., etc. So yeah, I want to sort of move on to the platforms' roles in all of this, and what should the platforms be doing, or what challenges do the platforms have? I know, Eliza, you had like a question around that.
Yeah, hi everyone. I was interested in thinking about the idea of collaboration between Twitter and the government, because obviously India is a hugely important market for these tech companies. And what was interesting about talking to Bhavjit was that obviously Twitter came out after the initial round of blockings and said that they weren't going to be blocking journalists anymore or sort of human rights organizations. But since then, he's experienced that Tractor to Twitter has been sort of shadow banned, if you will, and that they're reaching far fewer people than they used to with their posts. And I was wondering if any of you have seen any of this, and therefore whether there's a suggestion that there are more clandestine ways that Twitter is collaborating with the government.
Yeah, that might be quite an interesting question for Shristi, perhaps.
Thank you so much. I do think that this shadow banning technique is actually working a lot for both Twitter as well as the government of India, where they do not ban the particular handle overtly, but of course they limit the reach of it. For example, Tractor Twitter. So after it was withheld and one day suspended, its reach was massively controlled. Usually it was riding high on organic reach because of the farmers' protest, and it was posting the active messages from the protest. So founders were telling me that they got good numbers of followers, but after it was suspended, I think on 5th of February this year, so its reach was massively restricted. I also spoke to a couple of other people, other activists who run anonymous accounts who would not like to be identified. Their reach is also suspended a lot. One of them I know actually posts about Kashmir, and so he for last 1 year has not seen any follower increase in his one account, and he just usually post more about what is happening in Kashmir, especially after 2019 thing. But he also got the similar suspension notice, and after his account was not suspended, but it was shadow banned. So I think that there is not much awareness because the Twitter or the big tech in per se, they do not have like really transparent practices and policies where we can actually know like under this practice or this policy this particular act has been done. It's ever evolving document that they have, new rules keep on coming, and it's usually the users that the people who use or people who kind of propagate their thoughts online based on such platforms. They are not mostly aware about such rules and regulations that they have to follow, because again, like I said, it's a running document. So what I think is needed at this point is more transparency on account of Twitter as well as the other platform. For example, Facebook, Instagram, and of course the new Indian homegrown app called True. There was a recent investigation by Time where they found out that a Hindu radical group called Sanatan Sanstha, it was flagged a lot of time to Facebook. Despite that, it was not taken down for 3 months. This Sanatan Sanstha also approached the higher courts, and the higher courts also felt that it should not be reinstated. At the similar time, the same thing was also happening. Like, for example, I also wrote a story recently for Caravan India, where I highlighted that how the Indian government is actually blocking the RTI for getting to know more about like what illegal thing the Caravan India had done, like why its portal, the Twitter portal, was withheld in India on February 1 this year. But the government of India withheld the information saying that it concerns the national security of India and then they can't reveal it. Of course, um, here I would like to point out this very important thing. Like, in my limited opinion, I think the data as well as the users today are the currency that both the social media intermediaries as well as the government of India wants to control. So it's actually not a question between good and the bad. It's the question between the evil and more evil. And the way with the IT rules and the way Twitter and the other social media in a very opaque manner function. So we don't really know what is actually governing us. So and if one asks me, like, who to choose, like, who should govern us, the users or this currency today, I think it's a very difficult answer to really arrive at. We have also seen in the Delhi riots of last year, 2020, there was a massive role which was played during the Facebook lives and the Facebook posts of so many people. So much so that it actually, initiated a genocide. So we really need to look into the role of platforms with a holistic and, with a holistic and an objective way. At the same time, we also need to look into the role of the government, how it is trying to regulate. So in my opinion, I would say that the social media is not so safe place. At the same time, the government is trying to regulate it for because it's somewhere an unregulated space where still the freedom of speech in whatsoever domain, in like hate speech also exists, as well as the freedom of speech where you can propagate your ideas, where a person without any distinction, without any caste barrier, without any gender barrier, or without any education qualification barrier can come online and speak their mind. So it's a very open space, and all of them are trying to regulate it. Some are trying to regulate it for profits that they want to make out. Some are trying to regulate it for the advertisement. Some are trying to regulate it for the narrative functioning, and some are trying to regulate it for politics. There need to be a very strong and very very focused discussion around it, and that is why discussing this in Indian Parliament is very important. You know, that is where the government actually takes a short route. If I'm totally for the rules are needed, but at the same time, we need to have a very focused and very deliberate discussion around the same. And the IT rules are the rules; they are not actually discussed discussed in the Parliament as discussed by the other panelists over here.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, you one of the key aspects of all of this is definitely the platform's business models, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Despite any political aspect, what is the what is driving the platforms in how these, in how they're built, and and how their business models work, which I think is a really, really important consideration. But I want to sort of also go into like, what is the legal position of platforms though, especially when you have these global platforms across, different jurisdictions, India, I don't know, South Africa, United Kingdom, what if they do sort of toe the line of transparency and creating a space, freer spaces on their platforms, what legal powers do they have? Maybe Vakasha, you could speak on that.
Well, Vakasha, you're muted.
So this is where I mean, I almost have a bit of sympathy for the for the social media platforms in India, because I mean, I think we all know that we know their business models, their automation systems, their entire the way they sort of make notifications work. It is all meant to be maximized by profit. So they don't care if they're going to be promoting hate. They don't care if they're going to be promoting dangerous misinformation. None of those things. The idea is that, as what we're seeing is at least attempts around the world to kind of focus on those aspects to improve it. So get them to take on misinformation by putting tags about it. Maybe ban someone who's consistently doing that. Get someone to chase up on something like hate speech. Now, the tricky thing is that in India, actually, and this was summed up very well in a case which has been dragging on since last year. There's a news channel called Sudarshan News. It is utterly horrific just watching anything which they do. It's basically all just communal hate mongering. And they actually were doing this whole show where they were trying to show that there's a jihad on the bureaucratic services in India. Where in terms of the selection process, there's an attempt to try and get Muslims into it, and this equates to a jihad. Now, the way they advertised this program itself, before it even aired, the trailer they put out on social media and on TV was so provocative that there were attempts made to try and get the broadcast of the show blocked. The Indian government, which representations were made to it, they said they'd look into it. They said, look, these guys are giving us an undertaking. They're not going to break the law, so it's fine. No issues going ahead. Now, over the course of the episodes which were released, like, it's blatant hate speech. It was like the kind of things which you'd be seeing in Nazi Germany. That's what was being put out there. Stuff which was being done by Radio Rwanda back in the day, stuff which was being done by Der Stummer in Nazi Germany. That was the kind of stuff which was being put on this show. And this went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court started asking some very serious questions about regulation of hate speech, particularly in the context of television channels, because in India especially, we're seeing a lot of that on TV. And there was also a question that, okay, maybe we might have to consider it elsewhere. So, what should be the definition of hate speech? Trying to come up with some sort of constructive idea on that. The Indian government comes up with an affidavit where it says nothing on the issue of hate speech in general. There's nothing about, what should be done about the way these kind of TV channels are blatantly doing it. And instead says that, the biggest problem we are actually facing is digital media. And there's so much venom on digital media that needs to be covered. But the hilarious part is they're not talking about the venom, which is being spewed by people communally. They're talking about the sort of news outlets which they don't like. Now, that's sort of the problem. As you can see, there is no intent of the Indian government to look at regulation of hate speech in terms of actual hate speech. And you see that then in these new rules. Now, these new rules could have very easily had a clear set of guidelines on hate speech for social media platforms, which would have been great. But instead, if you look at the kind of the things which they're saying are grounds for raising grievances and grounds for what the social media intermediaries have to look at, it's most of it. Some of it is just entirely vague stuff like compliance with all laws in force. I mean, that's not doesn't really deal with any of the actual things which we are really looking at problems with the internet, except for maybe child pornography essentially. None of the other really big ticket things which we can see as being problems with social media platforms around the world are addressed at all in these rules. Now, the problem is, and the reason why I said I have a bit of sympathy for the social media platforms to an extent here, with all caveats involved, is that if they don't comply with government orders, there's a lot of problems. So so Yashaswini mentioned the blocking rules of 2009. This gets read with section 69A, which I mentioned earlier. And that's what creates the framework for getting things, for where they want things to be taken down. Now, what the biggest issue which you can see with what happened with trackers, Twitter, etc., is that they send a notice to Twitter, and actually Twitter is not even obliged to tell you according to the Indian law, and they're actually not supposed to tell you according to the Indian blocking rules. The blocking rules say that you have to maintain complete confidentiality on something, and that's it. And if you look at in terms of that there is supposed to be a review mechanism for any blocking order sent out by the government, but that doesn't even, if it goes to say a social media platform, technically, if on the plain reading of the rules, it doesn't even necessitate you as the person who's posted something to be informed. The right of reply is given to the publisher, the social media platform, but not to you. Now, what this does also is that, so one, they can send a thing saying, okay, we want this Twitter account to be blocked. Two, they will say you can't even talk about it. Now, Twitter normally sends something to any person whose account there's a request for suspension or any sort of action. But technically, they can't give any details really, or really give any clarity, because the government's own rules stop them from doing that. And then last, we come to the fact that if they don't comply, and this is what Twitter was finally being threatened with, is that if you don't comply with a blocking order, then action can be taken against you under the Information Technology Act, and criminal action, where a person who fails to comply with this order can be put in jail for up to 7 years. Now, this is what's now the biggest issue for a lot of social media platforms, is going to be this. Now, you might think, well, but it sort of should apply across the board. So, if someone's actually indulging in hate speech, and that's also taken up to these guys, and this should be providing protection to that as well. But it's not, because it's all, at the end of the day, discretionary for the executive, for the political executive. There's nobody else really playing a role in that. So the problem is that social media platforms, we are entering into it already at a global level, with them not caring about these issues. And in India, we're exacerbating the problem by having zero strategy about trying to actually deal with hate speech or misinformation or those kind of problems. And instead, we have an entirely opaque set of rules, which actually take away any chance of transparency, take away any chance of even the platforms trying to do a job here, and instead put all of the power in the government. And this is, again, and this is why, and Yashaswini might be able to talk about this more, that there is a challenge to the way these rules currently function in the Supreme Court at this time. It's about the way transparency works on the blocking rules, or about the way even the interception rules, which are there for surveillance, are all being challenged, because there is no judicial oversight or no legislative oversight on any. It's all the executive reviews its own actions, and that's supposed to be the great thing, that, oh wow, you got some accountability. There's none. And this is actually a huge problem, because this is not just about the BJP. This is these rules which were implemented previously, which have this lack of transparency, were by the previous government, by the UPA, the Congress government. And so essentially what we've had is year upon years of this kind of this erosion of any sort of accountability for any of these things, which means that now, when we need to have strong mechanisms to deal with this stuff, given the way social media is being misused, it's not going to happen, because at the end of the day, the people who are really, really misusing it are working for the government. Like, at the end of the day, the most amount of communal polarization is being done by people who have affiliations to or are supporting the government. People who are spreading misinformation are doing that. So it's actually really hard to see any scope for any improvement of the situation in India, because Parliament is being kept out of this entirely. The parliamentary committees are not being allowed to do anything. And the only hope is the courts, but even they now are taking forever to hear these things.
Yeah, it's really very challenging. But I do want to pose that question to Yashaswini that you touched on. What given these challenges, both on the platform side, the political side of things, state side, where are the opportunities then to promote, digital freedoms? What can, your average user or the media or, activists and activist organizations do then to, better promote the digital freedom? Yashaswini, maybe you could give some ideas.
Thanks, Chipo. I think, at the cost of sounding very philosophical, but I would like to say that the only way out for us is to carry on, and we can actually, because despite all these intimidating environment, and be it from the judiciary, be it from the executive side, we do have remedies still, and it's just that we have to persist, although it's an incredibly difficult space. And I think Vakasha and Srishti would completely echo how difficult it's been made over the course of the last few years specifically. But we do believe that the only option is to continue doing. But in terms of options in terms of seeking remedy, we do have to go to the court. So just to give you one example, the whole when the intermediary rules came into came into force, the whole buzz was that social media accounts are getting banned from India. That was the information which spread across. But in effect, the idea was the loss of that safe harbor which Section 79 of the Information Technology Act guaranteed. However, this intermediary status or the safe harbor is not like a license, or it's not a registration that it can be taken away by the executive. It's entirely a compliance issue which can be removed only by a court of law. So if a court can remove it, you can dispute the removal of it in the court. So again, taking it to the court and fighting for it, advocacy might seem like a lengthy process, but we have to do it. And I think I'm hopeful that in the long run, we would be able to sort of set in fruitful changes as well. And I think it's very interesting that Umran mentioned all the challenges to the rules. In fact, IFF has been assisting in many of these challenges. In fact, you were very closely involved with the Kerala High Court decision, and we're grateful for that. And really hope this is going to set the right trend. But yes, it's like incessant seeking accountability and actually probing deeper into what the law says. Just going back to the point that Bakasha said, that this overreach of executive orders. In fact, the new rules brings in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, who actually had no locus standi in the original statute. It was the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. So how is an interdepartmental ministry coming in and seeking, enabling these, or actually forcing these social media intermediaries to comply with their orders? So there are all these, legalities which actually are a lot more nuanced than how they are portrayed. And because they are more nuanced and because they remain as a legal recourse, we should be able to go to the court. However, unfortunately, on the practical side, it gets lengthy. The whole process, sometimes it gets frustrating, and we've seen on some occasions that the court orders have not entirely been in favor of a larger constitutional principles. But again, you have to keep persevering, and a rule book is all that we've got. A constitution is all that we've got. So when all the other doors shut, we have to go back to the constitution and fight for that. So pardon me for getting on this philosophical tangent, but I think when it comes to the everyday struggle for litigating and advocating for rights, this is the only thing which helps one keep their sanity intact, because otherwise everything else is out there to just choke you and chill your freedom of speech. And actually the judgment, a very personal thing is what I do on a very bad day, at the cost of sounding very geeky, is go back to Shreya Singhal and read that, okay, there are some people who think on the right track. So yeah, that's what we rest our hopes on.
No, thank you. I think it is really good to sort of take it to that philosophical place, how we should be thinking about approaching it. And it's sort of a nice sort of way to sum up everything that we've been discussing as well. I want to sort of now close and give our closing remarks. So Shristi, you're involved in the Right to Information application, seeking info on Caravan's Twitter account, which is, I guess, an example of taking the legal route, right? So yeah, just in closing, what do you sort of hope for that in terms of an outcome? And yeah, what else would you like to sort of say in closing?
Thank you so much. Actually, the thing is that the legal route is the only route that we have. But again, I would agree with my fellow panelists that it's very lengthy route. For example, we speak about the Shreya Singhal case. Shreya Singhal case is actually a very interesting case to discuss. So it was right after two girls from Maharashtra who were booked and arrested just because they posted that why should Mumbai lock down when a politician, because of the politician's funeral procession. So it was Shiv Sena and a very radical Hindu political party, and then both of the girls were booked. It was 2014. So civil society of India actually retaliated a very strong point. NHRC also, they felt like it's something which is wrong. And Shreya Singhal, she was just a student, and she realized how can they be booked just for something like a Facebook post. And then she litigated along with a couple of other lawyers, and I think IFF members were also part of it. And all of them, they litigated, and the Supreme Court also observed that why no one before actually pointed this out. That the rules, the law was passed in 2009, and after 2009, why even now something like this exists? So Section 69A was struck down. It was declared unconstitutional. Having said that, last year I did a story for Stories Asia in which I examined how this rule is still used. It's very much in play. For example, last year I interviewed a man based in northeast Assam, and he was booked under Section 69A, which is no longer legal. There's so many such examples where police invoke Section 69A. Recently, also Supreme Court
It's
and Home
66,
Ministry. Sorry,
60, just a quick
66A.
thing.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Thank you for correcting. Thank you. And so recently, also just a couple of days back, there was a guideline from Government of India saying that it should not be invoked. Section 66A. I'm so sorry. And so it's what I wanted to point out through this particular example was that even after the Supreme Court struck it down, there was a litigation which was against it. Still, people were being booked under it. So the road to actually getting liberty and freedom or through litigation is still very much lengthy. And the another important aspect that I want to bring to this is that I think, in my limited opinion, the parliament is the right answer to all these questions. So when a law is being passed, there should be proper debates, there should be proper discussions around it. For example, the Section 66A was also inserted in the IT rules of 2009 without the proper discussion. I think it was Manmohan Singh government at the time. Manmohan Singh was very heavily criticized at the time, and there was just a meeting after which the cabinet decided that they are going to insert this, and without any rules and regulations or discussion, it was inserted. So again, going on to the philosophical tangent and going on to the very basics of it, I think, in my opinion, we have to begin right, because otherwise the road is very long to correct it. And if we have to bring in new rules or regulation to govern the social media, which is important, we have to have strong discussions. We have to have deliberate discussions around it. Think it with every aspect, that how it is going to impact the life of citizens, how the rules are going to make it better, and then come out with something like this. And again, going back to the three pillars of our democracy, I think the system of checks and balances should be maintained. And without this, the road is very long. And I don't know how many people, individual cases, the people were jailed because of this thing. And so the impact over the individual citizen lives is very massive. India is so the way it considers this like a funnel. It's like there's a massive opening through which you will put in the rules and laws, and they would be applying to this one person, and that one person would face the entire brunt of it. So I think we should go back to the starting, and if we begin right, then it's going to happen. So of course the IT rules are now functional, and litigation is the only way. But just putting my limited opinions over here.
Just to jump in there a bit, because Chipo mentioned about the business model, and in India, what we see is that with big tech, Facebook has very good connections to the current government, and with Twitter, we see that the Twitter is being utilized well by the by the ruling party for its misinformation or disinformation campaigns, but it's also being used by the opposition successfully, and I believe the Twitter office in India was raided by the police recently because of the ruling party's accusations against the opposition. So in India, the big tech is very much they have very good political connections, and it's important to draw a line there and to see that big tech isn't politicized and used as a political tool. And just to end off on the philosophical note, regulation can't be arbitrary, and in UN General Comment 34 from the Human Rights Committee concerning the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, erroneous information or mistaken information can't be criminalized. A person can't be criminalized for making a mistake online. And what we see is that, with this law, the sweeping regulation, a person can be arbitrarily penalized, and that goes against the foundations of India's democracy, and that is against the standards we see in other democratic countries, like in the UK. So what we see, the scope for arbitrary misuse of power with these new IT rules. Thank you.
Thanks, Umran. So, Prakasha, we opened with you. Do you want to say your last closing statements before we end the session?
Yeah, so I think when we're looking at the space for digital activism and for the media and freedom on that count in India, I think the problem is essentially the only route to actually ensure any of that as of now is through the courts. And that's a problem, because while the courts are actually, sometimes they're doing the job, sometimes they take too long, but you know what, on the whole, courts eventually sometimes maybe get around to doing the right thing. But the problem is, if your whole space for activism is going to be, your whole space for speech is constantly being litigated in the court, that itself starts to create chilling effects and boundaries. And that's precisely, and again, now it's tragic that we're here 6 years down the line after in Shreya Singhal. The chilling effect was specifically addressed by Justice Nariman in his judgment for the Supreme Court there. Specifically addressed how that it creates problems. But what we're seeing in India is that that's not really changing. And it's not just about the IT rules. In India, we also have a massive problem right now. So, for instance, now this is creating a new way in which, you can go after platforms, as I said, like Netflix and Amazon. But already there were options. You have people who just want to create trouble, have been able to do that already. You can file criminal cases against people for speech where there's so little sort of investigation of the actual merits of the case at a basic level before filing the case, that you then have the threat of arrest, you have the threat of raids, you have the threat of, there are so many threats which you can put over a person's head for speech in India at this point. And that comes down to the fact that we have not yet been able to sort of get an understanding of the value of free speech for people in general and find ways to get more institutions involved here. It cannot only be the courts. We have to have parliamentary oversight. We have to have legislative oversight. That's something that's a culture which has to come in. Now, towards doing that, that's where, for instance, I think the Internet Freedom Foundation is actually a great organization, because they're putting in the hard yards on both counts there. They're fighting the case in the court, and they're also kind of trying to deal with awareness. And that's something which we in the media have to do as well. And that's something which they have to do as well, is kind of creating an awareness of the need for that kind of culture. Because as long as we're constantly going to think of rights being, people having to fight for these rights rather than these rights being the norm, it means that it's giving the government more and more of a chance to keep bringing in new things. So, you had the existing framework itself was enough to actually block off many organizations. And instead of looking at reforming the older problems, by having more, care with which, cases are being filed against people for speech, instead of having more care to ensure that the blocking rules were made more transparent. Instead, we're seeing more and more attempts to bring this under control. And in a sense, what the government is doing is they're preempting potential losses in the court. Now, 66A was struck down. Potentially 69A, the blocking rules could end up being struck down. You could have rules, more guidelines being brought in on issues of free speech in the filing of criminal cases. Now, what you've done now with these new rules is you're creating another front where you're going to have to go and fight this in court. Because, for instance, what you've done here is, and I mentioned this earlier, is essentially you're doing censorship by trolls. This is, instead of a person having to now even go to the police station and file a complaint and go through with that, which might be a bit of a process and which you might get judicial oversight over. Now, the system, especially for digital media, if we look at what they introduced here, was that if you have a grievance, you can file it. This is not social media, by the way. This is just digital news outlets, and there's no threshold here. It applies to everyone, like the smallest little blog which is dealing with the news to like a huge organization. You have to address grievances within 15 days, and if the person is unhappy with the grievances, they can just take it up, they can take it up then with the first level, which is a self-regulatory mechanism, which, however, is governed by the Information and Broadcasting Ministry, and then they can escalate it beyond that as well. to the central government. So what you're actually doing is you're now creating what the government's doing here is they're trying to create areas which they can keep even further away from the court. So just keep creating more and more hurdles. And that's because there is no parliamentary oversight, no discussion of these kind of rules when they're being enacted. And this is not just about this government. This is a problem as a whole. And I think so. Therefore, the conversations which go forward on this in South Asia have to look at. I think the societies themselves have to be looked at. There has to be more conversations within our societies of the value of all of this, because there's a reason we've reached this point that, in 2000, and what the Supreme Court said in 2015, from 2009 to 2015, what was happening? Where were the conversations even there? And this is a significant problem that we've not had these kind of conversations about what is the direction we want regulation of the internet to go through. What are have we really sat and identified what are the real key issues? Have we looked at how do you reconcile tackling actual issues like hate speech and child pornography with ensuring free speech? Those conversations are not happening in a social space, and because they're not happening in a social space, they don't happen in Parliament. And because they're not happening in Parliament, you have more rules being created which just take away rights more, and you now just have this constant opening up of fronts, and it's not healthy for a democracy. And countries like India, which are still, at least on paper, are constitutional democracies, have to have these conversations within society. And which again is one of the great things about having even this conversation is that we have to do this more, because if we don't do it here, our governments have no interest whatsoever in doing it for us.
Thank you so much, Vakasha. I think what you've just said and the other points by Yashaswini and Shristi in closing, and Umran in closing, just make me think, there's multiple aspects and things are always changing. So we definitely need more conversations, but it's a multi-stakeholder approach. It's users, it's platform businesses and other businesses, because capitalist interests come into play. It's government, it's parliament, and cultural institutions. So thank you so much to everybody. Really, really important conversations. I hope we, inspire more following this one. And thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.